began?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe it was 2000. So long ago now.
But this makes Paul very special because he's a graduate of our program, and we're very proud of our graduates, especially as they go on to do such great things. So Paul Morando is the chief of exhibits at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. And as I've mentioned, Paul holds a master's in history from the College of Staten Island. He graduated from us in 2003. Now, Paul began his career in the Army Museum program in 2003 as director of the Harbor Defense Museum, which is located at Fort Hamilton in Brooklyn, in New York City, so directly opposite Staten Island. And he has since served as director of the Casemate Museum at Fort Monroe in Virginia in 2007, and also as director of the Quartermaster Museum at Fort Lee in Virginia, and that was starting in 2011. In 2017, Paul became the chief of exhibits at the National Museum of the United States Army, which the project of which, the foundation of this museum, I've been informed by Paul, began in the late 1990s with an act of Congress, but it was only in 2017 that ground was broken on the present brand new building at Fort Belvoir in Virginia. This new museum opened officially in November 2020, appropriately on Veterans Day of that year, in November the 11th. But it closed shortly afterwards, like everything else, of course, thanks to the pandemic. However, its doors reopened in June 2021. And this museum covers 245 years of the history of the US Army in its galleries. So Paul Morando will speak to us today about the new museum exhibits in the Museum of the United States Army. And the title of his lecture is The Battle for Realism, the Challenges of Exhibiting War. And I'd like to hand now to our speaker, Paul Morando. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Iverson. Give me a second while I share the screen so you can see the slides. And I'm going to see if this is, can everybody see that?
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Okay, I'm trying to forward the slide. I'm having a little difficulty doing that. Just bear with me a second. Can everybody see that transition?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, greetings. Thank you for that introduction. It's great to be with everybody. I remember taking a class with Dr. Iverson probably about 20 years ago. And so it's really kind of neat to be here talking with him and talking with you all about a subject that very near and dear to my heart in terms of the history of the United States Army, and of course, the museum. And what I want to talk about today specifically is the challenge of exhibiting war, or exhibiting the military. And I'm going to focus on the use of technology to kind of give this talk a little structure. Developing an exhibit on the military is very, very difficult, because you try, or war in general, because from the causes to its aftermath, it's nearly impossible to provide a comprehensive narrative. As Dr. Iverson mentioned before, the museum covers 245 years of history. That in itself is difficult to fully expand and have every story told for an institution like the United States Army. Now, the mission of this museum is, of course, to tell the history of the Army, but we tell it from the perspective of soldiers, American soldiers who are in the Army, were in the Army, served in the Army. And each gallery within this museum covers a particular time frame. So from 1775 to the present, the artifacts and the stories provide a look into the rich history of the Army and its role in American and world history. So curating war is difficult, as I said. So for example, when you place a weapon inside an exhibit case, you elevate its status and kind of reinterpret that this object needs observation. In some cases, this weapon, right, it can be transformed in almost like a piece of art. You have a specially made custom mount, as you see there. You have special lighting that is used to bring out the rich detail of the weapon. And it's displayed in a very, very expensive, very climate controlled exhibit case. So you're elevating its status. However, you have to provide context as to why this particular weapon is on display. Did it belong to a soldier? Does it have a significant story or serve an important battle? Does it represent a major technological breakthrough that gave it a distinct advantage over the enemy and their weapon system? Also, what does it say about a country's ability to mass produce weapons and sort of have an advantage over the enemy? So this particular rifle actually belonged to a private, Martin Tehan. He served with the 508th Infantry, a paratroop infantry regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. He parachuted into Normandy, and on D-Day, he was immediately killed in action. Years later, this rifle was found by a French farmer, believe it or not. And the farmer, how do we knew it would belong to Private Tehan, is it's very hard to see, but on the butt stock of the rifle is his name that's engraved into the rifle. And we had, and how we received this, the farmer gave it to the military, the French military, then gave it to the United States Army. It actually sat in General Milley's office until it came to the museum to be put on display. And reason I talk about Private Tehan is because it's the story behind the weapon that matters, what his experience was during the war. And not necessarily just about the weapon itself, but the soldier who carried it. And that is the main kind of part, or main mission of the museum. So going beyond artifact descriptions, military museums also must focus on political aspects of war, which can be difficult to do. Now, I work for the United States Army as a civilian. And so it can be a challenge when you start talking about politics of war, and especially also big military institutions like the United States Army. Now, kind of getting into the main thesis of my talk in talking about technology in exhibits, curators of military exhibits understand that they can never replicate the true experience of war. Even though military museums constantly are trying to do that. You know, technology advances, museums that have the resources try or attempt to bring war sort of closer to the average visitor by doing very innovative, engaging exhibits and technology. Part of the aim is to kind of attract a new generation of visitors who have, this direct access to war on a daily basis, right? Through videos and images that you can easily get on your cell phone or on your computer. It's almost an instant access to war. Now, with that said, it's still uncertain whether or not this balance of technology and history can be met inside a museum. And what I mean is that technology should not be used to overshadow the history that is being presented. Sometimes when you go to a museum, the experience of an exhibit is the attraction, where it should be the history that it's trying to present. So that technology, whatever it is, should enhance the story, not replace it. For American military museums, this new access to war, as they discuss, challenges curators to develop a more realistic and convincing way or experience through the use of technology. Sometimes you'll feel that you have these temperature changes in exhibit halls, flight simulators. The idea is for museums and their exhibits to immerse visitors into the world of service members as if they were marching side by side with them into battle. Now, one could argue that this is just a reinvention of electronic gadgets that museums have always used, right? Illuminated battle maps, for example, large-scale dioramas, and sort of talking mannequins can be found throughout a lot of military museums in the United States. However, the key difference is the immediacy of how Americans today, or anybody today, gains access to images of war. I mentioned before the development of YouTube, Google video sharing websites, I believe has created a very profound change in how a younger generation or anybody looks at war. And I think museums have responded to this shift by incorporating realism on a major scale like never before. Now, the dilemma or the problem is one of achieving that symmetry between education and technology while providing an appropriate experience for visitors who come with different needs and expectations. So since we are a new museum, the National Army Museum, it might be helpful to provide sort of a brief overview and also how we highlight technology through the museum. Now, as Dr. Iverson said, we officially opened to the public on November 11, 2020. Pandemic had other designs for us, and we closed on December 4th, and then we reopened on June 14th, 2021. And we are located in Northern Virginia, in Lorton, Virginia, which is tucked in between Route 1 and I-95. Now you can see from this image, the museum is over 185,000 square feet on about 84 acres of land. And the museum, we have all the spaces that make up a large museum to include a theater, a lobby, a cafe, a gift shop, event space. But the exhibits, they consist of what we call the Fighting for the Nation galleries, and then also an Army and Society gallery on the main floor. We also have a special exhibition space on the second floor and other gallery spaces on the third floor, to include a Medal of Honor garden, which is outside overlooking the entrance. Now, like many new museums, we've utilized technology in a variety of ways, from simple touchscreen interactives to complex show control projections and immersive environments. There is no shortage of technical or tech components to enhance the visitor experience. And there are a few examples that I like to highlight to sort of complement my thesis. First, let's start with the theater. Excuse me. This is where we show an introductory film on the history of the Army. But it's not just a simple film, right? It's sort of this almost 360-degree experience where the floor rumbles when a tank drives by the screen. And then there's wind that's felt from fans in the floor and a helicopter takes off. The idea is to immerse the visitor into the story of the Army. And it is very effective and it is very powerful. But another experience is our Nation Overseas Gallery. In this gallery, we focus on the First World War. And now in this theater, as you can kind of see from the images, we constructed a very immersive environment where a visitor walks across a glass bridge that overlooks sort of a battlefield scene during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Now, it's very calculated. There's lighting, there's video, there's projections, and there's also this lighting sequence to mimic gunfire and explosions. And it's all timed to a specific sequence. And then another feature is this large globe that covers the history of World War II. And it is a video that's projected within the globe to make it seem as if the globe is actually spinning. And it does provide a very unique way to tell a very large story, which is World War II. And then lastly, we have this AV slider technology. So what you're looking at is these large AV screens that a visitor can physically move that links to the artifacts that are inside this case. Now, as you slide the screen in front of a specific artifact, information, videos pop up that correlates with the artifact. Now, what's great about this is that to learn more about an object, you have to engage with the technology. It doesn't necessarily do it for you. And currently, as a lot of institutions, we are also working on augmented reality programs, apps that create this experience in itself within the exhibits and artifacts, and it can be done through their cell phone. But for today, what I want to do is to give focus on my presentation. I want to highlight a specific gallery in the museum that we call Changing World. This discusses the most modern wars that the Army has fought in, specifically in Iraq and Afghanistan. And interestingly enough, all the galleries that we have in the museum, the one that focuses on a most current wars takes sort of a more traditional approach in telling that story. Now, of course, we have, AVs and some interactives, but there is a more balanced approach in telling this story. And the gallery focuses on individual soldier stories that are woven throughout the exhibit. Now, my contention is that through this gallery, we here at the National Army Museum, we have been able to find that balance, which I think has connected strongly with our visitors. Now, one of the challenges in putting this exhibit together, something that I worked on, a little bit during the installation or before the installation, is that the history of these wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, are still being written. It wasn't too long ago that we pulled out of Afghanistan. So that history still has to be looked at, it still has to be absorbed. And then of course it has to be written or updated. So the idea that there's not enough time has passed to truly assess those books and to kind of give a very comprehensive storyline. Also, can curators strike this balance between the more traditional approaches of using text labels, just artifacts and photos, versus the more sophisticated immersive elements that visitors often seek out in museums? Do we lose the narrative by removing the text panels and replacing them simply with videos and interactives? So in this nearly 4,000 square foot exhibit, the Changing World Gallery covers the content of conflicts from the fall of the Soviet Union to our nation's most current conflicts. The story of Changing World is less about Army history than it is about current events. So it relies far less on a dedicated historical setting for design effects. So the theme, right, Changing World, makes for a very interesting play on words, indicating that while the last 2 decades have been a time of near constant conflict, it is the individual soldier that must, as always, endure the challenges of war. So the gallery, as you can see, has sort of this rich palette of desert warfare colors, digital media, and 21st century media, and it's built as sort of this sort of grid cube-like exhibit designed to be very modular for future updates to the exhibits as needed. And then the floor plan has been configured to accommodate a significant macro artifact, which is this Bradley fighting vehicle that you see here. Now, this vehicle is in a tableau to kind of recreate the Thunder Run into Baghdad in 2003. So this is an actual one of the lead vehicles from that mission, a very significant vehicle in terms of modern Army history. Now, recently, you can see soldiers working on this exhibit. These are soldiers from 3rd Infantry Division who have very familiar about the operation of this vehicle. They are experts, and it's very, very important. What we did early on is to get real soldiers to help interpret their story. So they came in and put the appropriate markings on the front and the sides of the Bradley, to the number of duffel bags and MREs. And it really transformed this historic vehicle. It made it more authentic. And the fact that it was done by soldiers, like I said, gives it more credence. Now, the beginning of the exhibit, when you enter the gallery, the visitor will be drawn toward the fighting vehicle, as I mentioned, but their path will be interrupted by a full-size section of the Berlin Wall. Now, here we have sort of the closing chapters of the Cold War is being told. And to the left of this, and I don't have an image, is a case that has, the Big Five weapons. They're models of the Big Five battlefield systems that were designed after the Vietnam War. And then the exhibit area from there follows Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and then the critical end cap to this display is a single section to the collapse of the Soviet Union. But this single important moment takes the visitor to another section on peacekeeping and stabilization that focuses on how the Army were in hotspots like the Balkans, Somalia, Haiti, and even assistance during national emergencies such as hurricanes Katrina and Sandy. But the artifact I want to highlight here is the engine of Super 61. That is the call sign for the first Black Hawk helicopter to go down during the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia on October 3rd, 1993. You may popularly referred to as Black Hawk Down. There's a book written and a movie that followed, a very popular movie that kind of looked at that battle. So this particular artifact is its General Electric T700 engine, and it was located on the pilot side. So in August of 2013, the remnants of this wreckage were removed from the crash site and returned to the United States. Now, pilots Cliff Wolcott, Donovan Briley were killed upon impact. And then Staff Sergeant Daniel Bush, he was a Delta Force soldier, was mortally wounded while defending the remaining crew members after the crash. So why I chose this artifact? Because here's a very, very powerful artifact that stands on its own. No videos, no fancy projections is needed to enhance this story. We didn't choose to present this artifact in an immersive way. The artifact itself, you can see sort of the twisted, rusty metal, symbolizes what these soldiers went through, and what they experienced during that battle. And only a small label is needed to provide context to this artifact. And other ways we provide context is through, we do have docents and tour guides who can really flesh out the story that is connected to this artifact. Now, for me, as a curator, someone who does exhibits, I find this approach very, very effective, where the artifact alone tells the story. Even if you don't know the story, right? Just looking at this engine makes you think that it's been through something significant. Now, located directly behind the Bradley fighting vehicle that I talked about earlier is another tableau. This is a tableau that has 4 soldiers representing a dismounted patrol using all sorts of types of technology, such as a MarkBot to search for IEDs. Now, this tableau has been very popular with our visitors, especially GWAT veterans who specifically served in Afghanistan. They are drawn to the level of detail that's revealed in these cast figures. Now, I was very nervous about this tableau, about putting together this exhibit, because soldiers can be our biggest critics, especially when it comes to the type of equipment that is used in theater. So a lot depended on the unit you served in, when and where you served, specifically in Afghanistan. And more often than not, soldiers, what they do, they personalize their gear, meaning they add stuff to their person that goes beyond what they were issued. And a lot of it has to do just for practical reasons. So it can be very, very difficult to capture everybody's experience. So to solve this kind of problem, we focused on a particular unit, 2nd Cavalry Regiment, during their 2003 deployment to Afghanistan. And we make that very clear in our signage. So people understand, and veterans understand what we are trying to interpret and who we're trying to interpret. And in fact, once again, we worked with veterans. We worked with the 2nd Cav veterans who actually served during that time frame, and they helped us outfit these cast figures based on what they wore. So what we try to do is just capture a moment in time. And I think in doing this, it has resonated a lot, especially with our veterans. Now you can look at the attention to detail, the realism from this cast figure, not only from the type of weapons, just from the headgear, the patches, the protection that these soldiers have to wear during their service. Now, along the arc of this tableau is a section of floor covered in glass that contains various components of IEDs. So as a visitor, you walk on top of this glass case where there's buried IEDs, or sort of partially buried into this display. Powerful and very, visceral way of looking at these things that caused a significant amount of harm to our service members during these wars. Once again, we turned to the Army to get a specialist. So we had an EOD specialist who had experience, actually disarmed IEDs in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was very difficult for him to lay out this exhibit for us, because it brought back, obviously, experiences that he had a very difficult time doing this, had a difficult time talking about it. But nevertheless, he understood the importance of trying to tell this story to the American public. So his knowledge was extremely crucial in laying out this display. Now, the transition between Afghanistan and Iraq in this exhibit is an element composed of sort of blast walls, and then also these Humvee doors, and sort of this story of evolution of from what we called hillbilly armor to sort of the MRAP vehicle, and the difficulties we had early on of protecting soldiers in their vehicles from the devastating effects of IEDs. And in this display, which probably is the most powerful component of this gallery, is of a video screen that shows the impact of IEDs on our American soldiers. Originally, this film was supposed to be something totally different. It was supposed to be fairly, benign overview of some Army tactics during Iraq and Afghanistan. But my team and I made a conscious decision to change the video because we felt that visitors needed to see the impact of what these IEDs have done, and also to hear it. And the footage is extremely powerful, and at times can be very, very disturbing. But I felt it was necessary to convey what soldiers experienced during the global war on terrorism. And as I mentioned kind of earlier, the proliferation of videos on YouTube, Google, service members being hit with IEDs has grown tremendously. Now, so this, sort of new gateway into the world of modern warfare through the use of a computer, of your cell phone, it gives you a very, very intimate look to war. Often the video is very grainy, right? It's usually taken by a cheap digital camera or on your cell phone, only lasts about 30 seconds. But in some ways, it's become the new medium of how we capture war, how it's translated, and then how it's viewed by a good portion of the American public. And of course, as technology evolves, cell phones are now being used to capture video. And then you have all these video websites where anyone can display their videos, basically uncensored. And that's kind of a new phenomenon, or at least in the last 15 years or so. But it's hard to gauge the impact of this and that it's having on people to view their surroundings. But one could argue that more and more people want to participate and define themselves by the type of videos they post, right? We all know that in the web, social media has become this sort of self-expression. Now, majority of these videos that we show were taken by service members, were taken by soldiers themselves. And so a lot of times this is very, very powerful too, because it holds a lot more credence for the viewer because they know it's directly coming from someone who's involved in combat on a daily basis. This, and the footage is very raw, that it's unedited. At least that's the assumption. So it gives the viewer a feeling of authenticity rather than sort of the slick production of a news package, right? The video themselves they're not very good in terms of clarity. And sometimes it's hard to understand what is happening. But that's really what they're capturing, is sort of the chaos of war. And for many viewers, it's as if they're seeing what war is really like. And so we did put a disclaimer in the front of the gallery and even in the video itself that these images and sounds can be, difficult to watch, and we caution parents and to make a decision whether or not to bypass this section. But we often find visitors, watching this and getting real impact of what our American soldiers went through during the time. And to kind of bring my discussion or my presentation to an end, as I mentioned before, the overall mission of this museum is to capture the soldier experience on and off the battlefield. You know, military museums, they try to forge ahead with new ways to immerse visitors into the subject of war with the use of these technology, right? But the way society understands war, you and I, hasn't really changed much, right? A lot of it is based on your individual politics, right? Your social upbringing, your own personal experience, whether you served or not. And of course, other factors that are not easily interpreted. These views shape how we view war, right? And also how we experience exhibits that focus on war and the military. So on a kind of a positive note, and this image that I'm showing you is an interesting juxtaposition of our first cast figure of obviously of a Revolutionary War soldier. And the last cast figure interprets probably the most modern interpretation of an American soldier, and that's constantly changing. But you can see the differences, right? First, you can see the differences in size, right, and scale of American soldiers, but also, of course, the type of uniform, weapon, equipment that is being used. So, as you know, on a positive note, technology, of course, can raise the interest of a younger generation to who I think many have maybe lost touch with military history by providing maybe a different perspective on a never-ending activity like war. But instead of doing the same old thing, museums have a chance through the use of technology to get closer to the heart of war and translate it into, I would say, a true learning experience. And I hope my presentation today has sparked some questions about how, you know, museums, especially like an institution like the United States Army, depicts war, depicts the soldier's experience. And for us here at the museum, we, for the most part, solely focus on the soldier's experience, what they've went through, whether they were in battle or just served in the Army, both on and off the battlefield. So that concludes my presentation, and I really appreciate being here with you today. And questions, I think.
Paul, can you take down your PowerPoint, please?
How's that?
Great. Paul, thank you very much for your incredibly interesting, indeed revelatory talk. As I found particularly interesting as being that I teach a course in the Public History Certificate program that we now have here at CSI. I'm currently teaching it this semester, which is Museum Studies. So I found your talk particularly interesting. So yes, we'd like to open the floor to questions. And just to repeat what Joe and I mentioned at the start, could you please type your questions into the chat? We will curate these questions, and myself and Professor Frushi will read them out in the order in which they come in. So I invite you all to enter your questions into the chat for our speaker. Thank you.
I don't have a question, but more of an interesting observation, Paul. So one thing you pointed out that most veterans would definitely talk about it, and I myself served in Iraq in 2004, was the transition from what you called hillbilly armor to up armored Humvees and fighting vehicles. That was a huge, huge issue that we found. And I don't know if the museum does this. Do you talk about Route Irish at all, which is the road from the Baghdad airport to the Green Zone in Baghdad? And that was one of the deadliest roads in Iraq for IEDs. And it was one of the biggest reasons why we would have many of these up armored Humvees having to be introduced. And even when we did armor up those Humvees, we were still finding those IEDs were still very effective against the up armor. But as a veteran, it's great that you highlighted that, and I cannot wait to get to this museum.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for serving, Joe. Yeah, we do mention that we don't have much on it specifically, but one thing that I didn't show that I think I should have is the use or the development of what they call the Rhino, and you probably are very familiar with that. Essentially, it seems very sophisticated, but actually it's a very simple device that was used to kind of explode IEDs before it made impact on your vehicle, Bradley or what have you. And essentially looked like a metal flag that would be at the end or attached to your vehicle in some ways, and it would push out sonar or some kind of pulsating to trigger the IEDs before it would have an impact on soldiers. And we have one that was, you can tell, took a lot of impact and probably saved some soldiers' lives because of it. So the soldiers had to be extremely innovative to protect themselves because you're right. It was a struggle, and it was very, very, I think, difficult time, especially early on in the war.
I think I neglected to mention that, Paul, you served in the U.S. Army Reserve. Am I correct?
That's correct. I was a photographer in the Army from 1996 to about 2003. Yes.
How did you find that your own service contributed to your understanding, your response, your approach to the museum displays?
Yeah, I think it impacted it greatly on a couple ways. First, I had a deep appreciation for what soldiers do on a day-to-day basis. That's number one, because I saw it firsthand. And as a photographer, I got to get a chance to kind of, be embedded with infantry soldiers, MPs, all different types of soldiers. So I got even more of an appreciation for what they do, and the gear that they carry, the tanks that they drive. I mean, it's an unbelievable, what they do for us on a day-to-day basis. Even the training that is involved. So I get a lot of chance to accompany soldiers when they're doing all sorts of training. So I understood a lot in terms of laying out a museum, clothing a mannequin, how a weapon should be held, or just some experience and type of equipment that they use. But also, from maybe an artistic perspective, being a photographer gave me an eye, right? An eye for an aesthetic, for in terms of how an exhibit should look, how a photograph should be placed in a display. So I really owe a lot to my experience in the Army for what I do today.
Thank you. We have the first questions coming in the chat. So, Joe, do you want to kick us off with the question from Professor John Dixon?
Yes, this is from Professor John Dixon. He says, "Thank you, Paul, for a wonderful talk. As an early American historian, I am interested to know how much coverage is given in the museum to soldiers who fought in the American Revolution or 19th century wars, such as the War of 1812 and the U.S. Civil War."
Yes, we have, and wanted to talk a little bit about the Revolutionary War, and I'm glad that question was brought up. We do have dedicated galleries to the American Revolution and also the War of 1812, of course, the Civil War. So every major war that the United States Army has been involved in, we capture here at this museum. The challenge with the American Revolution, of course, is those firsthand accounts. They're out there. You have diaries of soldiers who served. A lot of it is told from the officer perspective, right? But there are a few pieces of original history of soldiers' experience during the Revolutionary War. And you got to remember, this was the birth of the Army. There was no Army until June 14th, 1775. And you can argue that it really wasn't an army then either. They just formed. They had to figure out how to fight. Where were they going to get the weapons and the uniforms to properly outfit these soldiers? And a lot of it, of course, was based on what's already out there from the British Army. But in 2025, and that's why it's so present to me, we're going to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. And here at this museum, we're going to open a brand new exhibit, a major blockbuster exhibit on the Revolutionary War. So what I've been doing in the past year or so has been traveling to museums, collectors and curators, institutions to bring original Revolutionary War artifacts on loan to support this 5,000 square foot exhibit. So I've been to Rhode Island, to Philadelphia, to Vermont, to Boston, you name it, and trying to tell this story. And so in fact, it has occupied my time and will occupy my professional time and probably personal time from now until 2025.
Thank you, Paul. The next question we have in the chat is from Robert Adamski, and he writes, did your experience at the Harbor Defense Museum affect your work at the National U.S. Army Museum?
So that was I think that's a great question. And I don't know if anyone on the call or in the meeting has been to the Harbor Defense Museum at Fort Hamilton. It's a very, very small museum that sort of captures a small portion or the coastal defense story of the United States and the building of these fortifications, not only in New York City, but kind of throughout the Eastern Seaboard. What I learned there was how to be, limited with staff resources to do any type of museum work. So it humbled me, and to figure out a way to just do a simple educational program, or just to update a simple exhibit case. When you don't have the money, the budget, the personnel to do it, you have to be very, very creative, very innovative, and you also have to learn how to work with people to get what you need, right? And I can't stress that enough in anything you do, whether you go on to be a teacher or educator or museum professor, whatever it is that you decide to do with your career. The ability to work with people is paramount to get anything done. So what I did, is let's say, for example, I needed to move something. So we would have cannonballs, right? Or large cannons that are outside. And we wanted to move it from point A to point B. I made sure I made friends with the construction guys that worked, or the construction folks who worked on Fort Hamilton, invited them over, gave them a tour of the museum, and told them some of the issues that I'm having. And it's very difficult to get this cannon mounted outside the museum for a display. And then more often than not, they were very, very generous to help do that. So my experience at Fort Hamilton helped extremely as I moved on to bigger museums and bigger organizations. And I never forgot how difficult it was to work in a smaller museum. But when I have, faced with issues or problems in these larger museums, I often think back to what I accomplished or try to accomplish sometimes at the Harbor Defense Museum. And it kind of, it helps me in this current position.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, the next question is from Professor Brian Averbush. He says, thank you, Paul, for this fascinating talk. As a U.S. Army veteran who served in Haiti in 1994-95 during Operation Uphold Democracy, I'm interested in your mention of that mission. I wonder if you could say a bit more about the museum's approach to the history of peacekeeping, such as in the Balkans, Central Africa, as well as Haiti.
Yes, we certainly cover those subjects. Now, of course, we don't give it maybe the attention that it perhaps deserves, because we, like I said, 245 years of history, of Army history, very difficult to capture, even in, 185,000 square foot space. So we do have artifacts that are directly related to those sort of peacekeeping mission or those type of missions. And we have narratives, we have soldier stories, but it's somewhat confined to maybe a smaller footprint than I would say the other areas in the Army's history. But a lot of times, we do, a lot of the feedback we get are from soldiers who served during that time period or in those particular campaigns and what have you. And even some of our volunteers. And that's where we get a lot of information from, because they, retired, whether they're colonels or privates or things like that. They can give us some little nuggets of information that you can't get in a book, you can't get from a newspaper article. And that really has helped in interpreting those stories, because then they give their own personal experience if they're talking about, like Operation Urgent Fury or those in between type of campaigns that that a lot of people may not know about. So that's where sometimes we overcome maybe the lack of material, the lack of displays on those periods.
Thank you, Paul.
May I follow up with something?
Yes, Brian.
Yeah, so I'm curious then, in terms of approach and methodology, do you treat peacekeeping like, is it mission by mission, or do you have a section of the museum or envision a section of the museum which is thematically like concentrating on peacekeeping and soldiers' stories and experiences with peacekeeping? And I ask because some countries have entire museums dedicated to their peacekeeping missions, and others, I think it might be the case with Canada, but I'm not sure, have an exhibit within their military museums that focus on peacekeeping. So I wonder if that could potentially be a productive approach.
Yeah, it definitely can, and we kind of handle it in two ways. One is we kind of weave those stories within the timeline of the exhibits at our permanent galleries. But we also have, and I probably should have spent some time on this and shown some images and things. We have a standalone gallery called Army and Society. It's a separate 10,000 square foot exhibit that is across from the Fighting for the Nation galleries. And those galleries is more of the, not necessarily a traditional approach, but a timeline approach from Revolutionary War to essentially Afghanistan. But the separate gallery then goes into a little bit more detail about the relationship between the Army and society, meaning, we talk about the role of minorities, African Americans, women in the Army. How did that change? How did the viewpoints change, not only within the Army, but also in American society as well? Because obviously the Army is a reflection, for the most part, of what's happening in American society. And so some of those missions, peacekeeping missions, are also covered in that gallery. And it's done because of sort of the global impact that it has, but also the impact that it has on American society specifically. So and that's more of a thematical approach. So that gallery is not a timeline approach. It's more about themes. We have a section called Reflecting and Changing. We have a section that, the army supporting society supporting the army. And you have all these different groups too that are set up to support soldiers, whether overseas or back at home. So that's one way we tackle it. And then other way where we can't tell every story is we do have an educational department who, does book talks, who do lectures, who do educational presentations to go a little bit deeper into those subjects that are not necessarily covered in the museum. Sorry, that was a long answer. Sorry.
Thank you, Paul. Our next question in the chat is from Professor John Wing. He writes, "Thank you, Paul. A fascinating look at how you and your colleagues consider different ways visitors experience the exhibits. I like how thoughtfully you consider the power of certain artifacts and the degree to which technology can enhance or detract from the visitor experience. How do you incorporate letters or other personal reflections from soldiers? And do these receive any technological enhancements like dramatic or recorded readings?"
Yeah, great question. There are a variety of ways how we kind of, use diaries or letters, postcards, for example. We have a very powerful postcard display in our World War I gallery. So the display is hundreds of postcards from American soldiers back to their families, right? And then on select postcards, they're kind of embedded in these kind of plastic where you can flip the postcard. And on the back of the postcard, you can see actually what the soldier has written back home. And some of these are just anecdotes of having a great time, eating bread in France and things of that nature. But it also gets a little deeper and darker about their experience in the First World War, which is a very harrowing experience in terms of, especially the massive use of artillery and things of that nature. So that's one way we kind of tackle that. We also have something we call our soldier story pylons. These are like sort of 8-foot stainless steel monoliths that have portrait of a soldier and their story. And often we have quotes that they have said over time. But what's I would say very interesting about this exhibit is not just the sort of hall of heroes, if you will, right? These are also just everyday soldiers, some still living, some from all different periods, walks of life, different experiences. And it's not just Medal of Honor recipients, Bronze Star recipients. There are those who had a different impact on the history of the Army, but more importantly, it resonates with visitors, right? Sometimes it's hard to define, what an infantry soldier experiences, because majority of soldiers are not infantry, right? They're not on the battlefield and enduring sort of that difficult, combat-related stuff. What about the logistics of war, the quartermaster soldiers, the sort of the army behind the army? Without them, without their work, without IT specialists and things like that, that's all designed to support that combat soldier. Without them, those infantry soldiers and those aviators, all those folks who are in direct combat could not function, could not do their job successfully. So I think we do a good job in pulling quotes from soldiers, which is very powerful, very simple, but very powerful way to highlight their experience.
Thank you. While we're waiting for more questions to come into the chat, and I do invite you all to please contribute there. I have a question for Paul. Very interesting to me, of course, was thinking about the mission of the museum and the mission statement of the museum, which clearly your exhibits are responding to, in terms of not only covering the history of the US Army as an institution since its creation, foundation, but above all, as you said, to document the soldier experience and also to put that in a historical context. My question is, in the process of developing the exhibits, I mean, obviously you've had a lot of input, I imagine, from, you said, from veterans, from active service members, also presumably also military historians. Have you experienced any kind of controversy as regards the way the story, the exhibition narrative should be told? I mean, I'm thinking back to the mid-90s and the enormous controversy that surrounded the Enola Gay exhibition, which, for people who don't know here in the audience, this was a proposed exhibit that was to be mounted at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in 1994-1995, which sparked a real firestorm of political controversy involving politicians as regarding how that story should be told, because the Enola Gay was a bomber that carried the atomic bomb for being dropped on Japan. So I wonder if you could respond to that as regards, obviously, the museum in society and politics. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a tough question. Certainly the Army has been involved in things that are controversial, subjects like My Lai and Abu Ghraib and Wounded Knee and things like that. We don't have, we have not received sort of a negative response to any type of, artifacts that we put on display. The challenge, I think, is the trying to strike a balance from applying sort of a critical lens to the history of the United States Army. Remember, I worked for the United States Army as a civilian. This museum is meant to kind of, show what's the service and sacrifice that American soldiers have given to this country from 1775 on. Now, a lot of the Army today, in the last, I would say, 20 years, they have what's known as Army values, right? These are, and Joseph might be familiar with them, personal courage, loyalty, duty, respect, self-service, honor, integrity, personal courage. These are all things that soldiers have to live up to. That's not easy for anybody to do that, whether you're a soldier or not. But as a soldier, you have this, you put up on this pedestal that you have to abide by these kind of values. And obviously soldiers over time have not always upheld these values. And that's kind of the argument we take, that this is not indicative of what the Army is all about. But we're not going to whitewash it. We do talk about My Lai and Abu Ghraib and things that not always show a positive light of soldiers in the United States Army. And that's where I think, if anything, those particular subjects, and there are more, of course, we often have to find ourselves maybe being a little bit challenged and exploring a little bit more deeply. Now, where we can do that is when we bring in Army historians who can flesh out those subjects to have a balanced narrative versus just this one-sided view of things. Because when you get into the politics of war, it is extremely difficult to display that in an exhibit from all sides of that subject. But I think to kind of address that is with book talks, lectures, conversations, and discussions that are hosted by this museum. And we've already done that, and I think we'll continue to do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. A very interesting topic. Joe?
Yes. So we have another question from Professor Averbush, partly related to the first question. As far back as the Revolutionary War, but perhaps more and more often in the 20th and 21st centuries, the U.S. Army has increasingly fought and conducted other operations as part of international coalitions, alliances, and of course, the United Nations. How does the museum present that historical context while at the same time keeping the focus on the U.S. Army?
Yeah, that's a great question. While we do mention, sort of the U.S. involvement in those type of operations and supporting, other nations, I would argue that a lot of it, we don't have significant amount of information related to that type of subject. And clearly, like I said, 245 years of Army history, right? And getting back to some maybe Professor Ivison's question about complaints, we often get feedback saying, well, where's the airborne section in the museum? Where's the artillery section? Where's the infantry section? Where's my unit? There are a lot of units in the United States. There are, and from small to big and everything in between. And so we often have to kind of challenge back and say, well, we can't cover everything. And I think that's the case for that question. That we can do little snippets. We can have some areas where we do discuss how we're involved in those type of operations in terms of United Nations and things of that nature. But it's obviously not our primary focus.
If I may just ask, so it's an interesting question, because quite apart from the United Nations thing, I don't know if it's still on the menu in basic warrior training or not, but we were schooled as wide-eyed, clueless recruits in the fact that Baron von Steuben, the Prussian officer, was the great grandfather of us all in terms of drill and tactics and things like that, and so that connection to Germany. And so it just occurred to me that right from the beginning, there are those kinds of international contexts, but then more famously, of course, most famously, I suppose, World War II, with the Allies and fighting as part of the embryonic United Nations. So and of course, soldiers in their own stories, they are constantly encountering serving alongside other armies and working with other peoples. So, and I have the general impression, but it's anecdotal, that many people in the United States, often civilians, but not exclusively, are kind of unaware or less aware of that international context. And that's sort of why I brought it up.
Yeah, thank you for doing that, because that helps. Certainly we don't. Certainly we talk about, and especially during World War II and World War I, we don't not mention our allies in those wars. And the same thing you mentioned about von Steuben. We have a video that shows how he's drilling and training soldiers and things like that. So there's definitely an international context to the building of the United States Army, of course, but also in working with our allies in multiple conflicts throughout the world. So I guess there's not a specific section that talks about it. It's kind of woven like I think most successful museums, they weave those storylines throughout the galleries versus having specific sections that highlight that individually. So thank you for helping me there.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat from Professor John Dixon. He writes, Paul, for students who might be interested in pursuing public history careers, can you briefly say more about how special exhibits at the National Museum of the United States Army are conceived and designed? Who is involved? How long do they take to organize?
Yes. So I can really speak to that now because we are in the process of designing, organizing a major exhibit, like I mentioned, on the Revolutionary War. It takes a lot. It takes a lot of people, and the right people who can help you navigate sort of the pitfalls of developing an exhibit. So, for example, I was just on the phone on a Zoom call with two Revolutionary War historians that specific to the Army, because what I'm trying to, I guess the mission of this or the theme of this exhibit that I'm trying to focus on is, of course, a soldier's experience, but why did they fight? Why did they fight? Now you would think, oh, because they were patriots. They were all about patriotism, fighting, the British and all taxation, all these different things. Well, no, it wasn't just about that. And in fact, it's very similar to why soldiers today join the army. Adventure, get away from maybe the life that they live, or to seek a better life in some degrees. So I just found that fascinating. That 250 years later, to some degree, there wasn't much difference in why they fought. But the key to get back to your question is you have to figure out a way to tell a story that's going to be digested by your visitors. Do it in an intellectual way, but you cannot put a book up on a wall or on a display because you're going to lose that interest. And the process especially for a big exhibit, you have to work with a designer, you have to work with a fabricator, and of course you have to work with all the historians and curators to try to tell this story in a very impactful way. Of course, it takes money, it takes a significant amount of time, and it also takes a lot of backward planning and ensuring that you're meeting those deadlines and goals to get a project. So I've started in 2021 or 2022, I should say, early, and the exhibit's not going to open until 2025. So that gives you an idea of how long it takes to develop a major exhibit. And in some cases, I probably should have started early. But you just don't have that much time.
Thank you, Paul. I'd just like to, while we're waiting for one or two for chat questions to come in, I'd just like to add a follow-up question on what Professor Dixon asked, and that is concerning the museum's collection history. You said something about the ways that objects, artifacts have entered the collections, people donating them. I imagine also the museum actively collecting them, also from private loans. Could you say something more about the collection history, when it was first formed, the principal sources, and also the difficulties of, shall we say, archiving the collections? If you have a Bradley tank, the armored vehicle, you can't exactly just put it on a shelf, which of course speaks to the difficulties of installation as well. So if you could say some more about that, please.
Honestly, the beginning of, I guess, collecting for the Army started right after the Civil War. Believe it or not, General Meigs was quartermaster during the Civil War, and he was with Lincoln when he got shot, and things like that. So he understood early on that there needed to be, whether it's a museum, but there needed to be a repository for Army material that, from a historical perspective. So from that, it grew. And like anything else, as modern museum, methodology and collecting and preserving evolved, so did the Army's collection. And one of probably the first Army museum was West Point Museum, which still exists today. It is considered the oldest. This is one of the oldest Army installations in the United States. So they too, began the significance or the importance of collecting the Army's history, and from there, it kind of grew. So we currently, the Army Museum collection has close to 500,000 objects that are all cataloged, all accessioned in terms of a database and things of that nature. And we have a professional, state-of-the-art storage facility, basically about a mile away from this museum, that stores a good portion of them. That gives us the ability to kind of pick and choose what artifacts to tell those stories. Now, sometimes you don't have the artifact that you want. That's where you then can, look for objects. Other museums like the Smithsonian, which is not that far away, they too have a wonderful military collection, and that we often work with getting loans for different types of exhibits. There's sometimes you get wonderful artifacts that just come into your door, right? Comes into the museum. 99% are things that we already have, are not necessarily significant to the Army's history, and a lot of things that people just want to unload their stuff that their grandparents or parents. But a lot of our collection was donations from the American public. Some were purchased, and some were just kept within the Army's inventory that had, like a Bradley, for example. That wasn't easy to get. You have to remember, there's all sorts of things on that Bradley that are not safe. And dials that have radioactive material and things like that. So it's not as easy as just taking a vehicle off the battlefield and putting it on display. You have to. There's a lot that is involved. So I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but we do have sort of a professional collection that's curated properly, inventoried properly, that makes my job a lot easier.
Thank you, Paul. We have a next question from Robert Adamski. He asked, does the museum tell about and coordinate with the other Army museums, such as Quartermaster, Engineer, etc.?
Yeah, so I want to try to make this a long answer, but the short answer is yes. We a lot of our SMEs, are subject matter experts on different parts of Army material culture, reside in those Army museums like the Quartermaster Museum, Infantry Museum, MP Museum. There are almost on every Army installation, or I should say every major Army installation, a museum. And they tell that particular, whether it's a unit, MOS, or whatever it is, part of the Army, it's done to train soldiers, for soldiers to come through to get a sort of esprit de corps, to understand what their unit or a particular job series has done over time. So quite often we do work with those other museums. If there are artifacts that we want to highlight here at the museum that they have on display or they have in their storage facility. And they also help us tell that story, because they are the experts on that subject. But like anything else, when a new stand up of a new national museum, this big, giant behemoth of a museum, there is also a lot of fear out in the field museums that they're going to start become, not that, in terms of funding, in terms of personnel, that they're going to be reduced in order to support this major museum. And that necessarily hasn't happened yet, but there is some fear there. But for the most part, we work very well together.
We have just one last question in the chat, which I think will have to be our last question of today. And that is from Michael Bruno. And he writes, "Great presentation, Paul. You mentioned earlier in your talk how your museum has implemented new technologies that somewhat immerse visitors into the experience of the soldier. How have you found a balance between respecting the experience of the soldier versus making an exhibit feel like an amusement ride?"
Yes. And you're right. I don't think I answered that question right in my thesis. I really appreciate that. I think the museum has really done a great job in finding that balance, meaning it's not filled with just sort of these Disney or these type of experiences simply for entertainment. Now, of course, there are those elements within the museum, but it's always driven towards an educational purpose. And I think for the most part, we succeeded in finding that balance. I would argue that sometimes, when you deal with, and I think any major institution deals with this, like places like Colonial Williamsburg, maybe that might be a bad example, but there are others out there that use what they call edutainment, right? The idea of making history sort of, just a playful experience, that undermines really what you're trying to do is educate the public on a particular subject. So I think most galleries, we succeed in doing that. We do have an Army Historical Foundation. They sponsor these 3D rides, if you will, in a separate section of the museum, which is not, they try to tie it to the narrative of the museum, but in the end, it's just a fun experience to the public. And so in any institution that you're trying to engage the public in, you're always going to have that little battle, right, of entertainment and education. But we are strongly on the side of education in our exhibits and how we interpret the Army's history. And there are some elements of entertainment, but it does not overwhelm the visitor's experience.
Thank you, Paul, very much. Okay, we're turning 3:30 and bringing our event to a close. I'd just like to thank, of course, our speaker, Paul Morando, for his extremely interesting, fascinating talk this afternoon. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else has too. So I hope you'll show your appreciation with the clap icon, whatever it's called, the emoji in your Zoom window. I'd also like to thank my colleague Joe Frusci for his assistance and co-moderation of this event, and everyone involved in getting the word out on this event. As I said, this is the last lecture in our fall lecture series, but we will return with the start of the spring 2023 semester with our spring 2023 lecture series. So look out for that when it is announced. So once again, I'd like to thank our speaker, Paul Morando, and I'd like to thank all of you for your attendance, and to wish you a very good afternoon and happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.